They said I was writing letters to a dead man. That was how it all began. Not with a whisper. With a sentence. Cold and direct, like a shot in the back. Someone said it out loud, in the corner grocery store, their voice cutting through the air like a sharpened blade. And the others? Well, the others didn't need to confirm it. Their silence was enough. Their eyes turning away from me, as if I carried a disease that could be caught just by looking. I was the girl who wrote letters, the one who, in the middle of the war, didn't have the good sense to stop. While all the women in town dressed in mourning, hung flags with gold stars in their windows, and cried quietly on the church pews, I kept writing. And worse still, I wrote to someone the government had already listed as missing in action. It was December 1943. Biting cold, low skies, the smell of damp wood and bitter coffee in the mornings. The streets of Greenville, South Carolina, were quieter than ever. Children played less. The church bells seemed heavier. Every week brought new telegrams. Every telegram took another piece of the town with it. But I didn't cry when the mailman stopped coming. I kept sitting on the same bench every late afternoon, in the same garden as always. Pen in hand, paper on my lap. And I wrote. I wrote as if he were still there. It wasn't a habit. It wasn't denial. It was something else. Something I couldn't explain. And didn't want to. She's lost her mind, some said. She's stuck in the past, others whispered. I heard it all, even when I pretended I didn't. My mother stopped going out with me. My father avoided me. At church, the pastor looked at me with pity, but also with fear, because to them, my suffering had passed its expiration date. They expected me to cry at a funeral, fall silent after mourning, and move on, like any decent woman should. But there was no funeral, no body, no ending. So they decided to create one for me. They turned my pain into a spectacle, a warning, a reminder of what happens to those who feel too much for too long. I wasn't seen as a woman of faith or loyalty. I was the example of what not to be. A face pointed out in the town square. A story mothers used to teach their daughters. See what happens when you don't let go. But what no one understood, and perhaps never will, is that I wasn't writing to a dead man. I was writing so he wouldn't die. Not completely. And even if everyone called it madness, even if the entire town fell silent or whispered when I passed by, I continued. Because deep down, I knew something still wasn't over. Not there. Not with those letters. Not with him. It was as if the whole town had learned how to die in silence. Mornings in Greenville no longer carried the sound of children running along the sidewalks, nor the cheerful noise of radios playing in kitchens. Only the creak of windows, the wind cutting between houses, and the dry sound of the mailman's footsteps, steps everyone now listened for in fear. Each delivered letter was a sentence, a son who wouldn't return, a husband gone missing, a father turned into a memory. Families began hanging flags in their windows. Blue stars meant someone in the house was serving. Gold stars. Those hurt. A gold star was like a period at the end of a sentence, a silent way of saying, we lost him. And Greenville was full of them. The churches began holding funerals without bodies, memorial services for soldiers no one knew for certain were dead or prisoners. Some families mourned medals, others, only a neatly folded uniform. And all of them, without exception, carried the same expression on their faces, contained grief. That was how everyone was expected to deal with loss, with composure, with acceptance. But I chose to write, not out of disrespect, not out of stubbornness, but because it was the only way I knew how to keep breathing. My family's house stood on a quiet street, lined with tall oak trees and well-kept yards. On the right lived Mrs. Mabel, who lost both her sons in the same month. On the left, the Higgins family, who left an empty plate on the table every night in honor of their youngest brother, missing in the Pacific. I saw it all, and they saw me too. I saw eyes turning away. I saw heads quietly shaking whenever they noticed me sitting on the porch, writing in my notebook. It was as if I were an open wound in the middle of a town trying desperately to heal itself. But I couldn't stop. My letters weren't about bombs, trenches, or military glory. I wrote about the day the rain fell on only one side of town, about the woman who sold apple pies and yelled at the children in the park, about the flower that grew through a crack in the sidewalk. That's what I wrote about. Small things, ordinary things, details that meant nothing to anyone else. But to me, they were everything I still had to give him. People said, "He's gone." But I didn't feel that way. His chair was still in the living room. His favorite cup was still in the cabinet. And the nights. My God, the nights still carried his scent. So I wrote, and with every line, I kept a part of him alive. Some thought it was madness. Others, desperation. No one saw it as courage. But I did. And even though my writing brought no reply, no answer, no hope, still, every single day, at the same hour, I sat in the porch chair, looked up at the sky, and wrote as if he could hear me. And inside me, he was still there. In the eyes of others, I had lost an acquaintance. A kind young man, maybe a good friend. That was all. No one knew what existed between us. Not my mother, not my sisters. Not even the neighbors who loved watching through their curtains. Because our love never had a stage, no applause, no witnesses. There was never a ring, never an engagement dinner. He didn't promise me the sky, and I never asked for certainty. The truth is, everything between us was built in silence, between ordinary life and what we felt inside. We met in the late afternoons, behind the small public library where almost no one passed by. We sat on a wooden bench, not speaking much. Sometimes he brought me a chocolate wrapped in a handkerchief. Other times, he just looked at me, and I felt as if the whole world stopped right there. He wasn't the kind of man who charmed crowds. He was quiet, a little awkward with words. He worked at his uncle's shop, fixed radios, and could understand any engine with his eyes closed. But when he looked at me, it was as if I were the only person who existed. Our love was made of details. He listened to me carefully, as if every word I spoke deserved to be kept. He knew exactly when I needed silence, or arms around me, or warm bread with butter and chamomile tea. But we never said "I love you" out loud, not because we didn't feel it, but because it felt as though saying it might break something sacred. It was a love that lived more in gestures than in words, more in glances than in promises. That's why, when he left for the war, no one understood my pain. In the eyes of others, I had no right to it. I wasn't a widow, nor a fiancée, not even an official girlfriend. I was just Mrs. Clara's eldest daughter, who became too quiet after the mechanic's boy shipped out. And that was what crushed me. The fact that my pain had no permission to exist out loud. I cried alone in my room, locked myself in for days, and when I came out, I was already someone else. But no one noticed. Because in the eyes of the world, I hadn't lost anything, but I had lost everything. Because no one knew he wrote me letters full of spelling mistakes, but with words so tender they made me tremble. No one knew that on the day he left, he held my hand so tightly it left marks on my fingers, as if he wanted to take me with him. And no one knew that deep down, we had a plan. We had an after. We had the kind of love that didn't need to be seen to be real. and maybe that's why it hurt so much. Because when he stopped answering, when the mailman began to ignore my gate, I didn't just lose someone. I lost an entire world that no one ever knew had existed. So I wrote. Because in the letters, at least in the letters, our love still had space to exist. Even if I was the only one who remembered him. People never say what they really think directly. They circle around it. They use short, polite phrases, always with a small smile meant to disguise discomfort. You need to take care of yourself. He would want you to be happy. Everything has its time. But what they really meant was, stop. Stop writing. Stop waiting. Stop believing he might still come back. My mother was the first, with her pressed apron and the hollow eyes of someone who had lost more than she ever said out loud. One day, while I was ironing clothes in the living room, she stopped behind me and said, "It's enough, my daughter. It's been too long." I didn't answer. I just kept sliding the hot iron over the shirt that, unintentionally, was his. I still kept some of them. Not for the fabric, but for the smell. It was all I had left that was still his, and not the war's. The church came next. The pastor preached an entire sermon about acceptance and release, and looked at me for almost half of it. The women from the choir avoided me after Mass. Some said I needed stronger prayer. Others just looked away. Their faith had no room for doubt, or for persistence like mine. And the neighbors, well, they spoke quietly, but loud enough for me to hear. At the butcher shop, at the market, at the seamstress. That girl is still writing. All alone all day, as if he were coming back. They say she keeps the letters in a box, like a girl's diary. It wasn't cruelty. Not really. It was fear. Fear of what I represented. Because I didn't grieve the way I was told to. I didn't follow the mourning manual. I didn't enroll in the city sewing class. I didn't join the Women Rebuilding Their Lives group. I just wrote, every day, without fail. It was my ritual, my way of keeping a minimum of order in the world after chaos. But to them, it was imbalance, madness, a sick attachment. Even my sisters began to look at me differently. The youngest offered me a new notebook to write other things. The middle one suggested therapy, without really knowing what that even was. And time. It pressured me too. Almost 2 years had passed, and his absence was becoming more solid than any memory. There were no letters from him anymore. Only mine. And they piled up like bricks in a house where only I lived. I knew that by then, no one believed anymore. Not in me. Not in him. But I kept going. Because stopping would mean admitting that everything we lived never existed. And that I could not accept. If I wrote one more letter, just one more, maybe he would hear it. Maybe, in some way I didn't understand, my words were still reaching him. Or at the very least, they were keeping me here, so that I wouldn't disappear along with him. My letters were never about trenches, bombs, or military strategies. I never wrote about the war. Not about pain. Not even about longing. At least not in the way people expected. I wrote about the corn cake that didn't rise. About the neighbor's dog that now barked only at night. About my aunt's record player that got stuck on the same song and kept singing the same chorus. Small things. Too small for a world at war. But those were the things that kept us alive. In the letters, I told him how the morning sun hit the wall of the room that once was his. I told him the backyard tree now cast shade halfway across the wall. That the same woman at the general store still gave the wrong change and apologized with a smile. I knew he might never read them. But I also knew that if I stopped writing, he would disappear for good. Because I was the only one who still spoke of him in the present tense. Everyone else had buried his name along with the telegrams. Over time, the letters became a ritual. a kind of silent resistance, not against the government, not against the war, but against forgetting. With every line I was saying, you existed. You still exist here. I wrote when the town slept, when no one could judge me. Sometimes I lit a candle beside the paper, as if it connected me to something unseen. And I wrote slowly, as if he were waiting for me on the other side of the page. It wasn't just love. It was survival. Because little by little, I was beginning to disappear myself. My eyes were different, my voice lower. I forgot simple words. I slept too much, or not at all. Sometimes I spent the entire day waiting for a single minute of peace. And it was only when I wrote that I felt my heart beat strongly, as if I were still alive inside. It was during that time that I began keeping the letters in an old wooden box with rusted hinges. It was the box where my grandmother used to store embroidery. Now it held pieces of me, carefully written pages, folded over and over, some stained with tears I didn't even realize were falling. There was never an answer. And still, I continued, because those letters were not just for him. They were for me, to remind myself that before the war, before the silence, before the judgment, there was us. A love that never needed public proof, that lived in gestures, in glances, in details, and that now breathed through those pages I refused to leave blank. While everyone else moved on, as if the war had taken only men and not entire pieces of the women who stayed behind, I wrote. And by writing, I resisted. It was a Tuesday, 10 in the morning. A sky far too clear for what was about to happen. I was at home, folding sheets, when I heard the knock on the door. 3 sharp, precise knocks, the kind of sound you recognize even before opening. I knew. Everyone knew. In those days, the army didn't call. They didn't send a telegram when the matter was final. They came, in uniform, hat in hand, eyes lowered. I opened the door slowly. He was there. Young, clean-faced, freshly shaved. He held an envelope in his hands, and in his eyes, the same thing I had seen in so many others around town. Pity, disguised as respect. Mrs. Elena Alvarez? I nodded. My throat locked. He spoke briefly. Didn't look me in the eyes for long. It was as if he had repeated that speech so many times it no longer hurt. We have confirmed the death of Soldier Matthew Joseph Miller. And he continued, reading the details as if each word had been printed with fire. Date, approximate location, combat conditions, no remains recovered, official declaration, a piece of paper, a signature, an ending. I thanked him, because that was what was expected. I took the envelope with steady hands, even as my legs threatened to give way. I closed the door without another word, and I stood there, in the middle of the living room. That was it. No scream, no collapse, no scene. I didn't cry. Not then. I just stood still, the envelope in my hand, and a strange feeling inside me, as if everything had finally been said, and yet nothing had truly been understood. The news spread quickly. The town exhaled. Someone left flowers at my gate. The church said a prayer in his name that Sunday. My mother held me tightly, as if that piece of paper had finally given her permission to cry with me. But I remained silent, because for everyone else, that was the end. For me, it was just another cut. In the days that followed, I realized they expected a change, that I would stop writing, that I would tear up the old letters, that I would close the box and make room in my life for another story. But I didn't stop. I began writing even more. Not with desperation, with precision. My writing changed in tone. It became shorter, drier, At times, it felt as though I were taking notes so I wouldn't forget, as if I wanted to record every detail before time erased his memory too. The town relaxed. They thought I was dealing with reality. Some even said I had matured, that now, finally, I was ready to move on. But the truth is that something inside me had closed, like a door locked without a key. It wasn't denial. It was intuition. Because no matter how much everyone had said goodbye to him, I felt deep down that the story wasn't over yet. Not for me. Not for him. After the official notice arrived, everything grew quieter. Not the normal silence, the kind that comes with grief. With slow-moving days, it was another kind of silence. Colder. Heavier. As if I had stopped being seen as someone in pain and had become merely inconvenient. The town seemed to have forgiven me now that I had accepted it. They believed the chapter was closed, that the war had done what it always does, taken without asking. And all that was left for us was to move on, gather the pieces, return to living. But I kept writing. No longer on the porch, no longer in daylight. Now it was at dawn, in secret, with the door locked and the windows shut. I wrote with a small candle beside me, my body hunched over the table, as if hiding the words were the only way to protect them. It was as if everything I had left had been reduced to that paper. The wooden box no longer held them all. I had to tie a ribbon around it, as if that could contain what was inside. There were more than 100 letters there, all written after his death was confirmed. 100 letters to a man who, according to everyone else, no longer existed. Little by little, I stopped going places, church, the market, even Sunday lunches with my family. Everything began to feel distant, as if it no longer belonged to me. People noticed. At first they spoke with concern, then with contempt, and finally, with that kind of pity that cuts deeper than any insult. They said I had disconnected from reality, that I had gone completely mad, that no one could endure pain for that long and still be normal. But no one knew. No one saw what I saw. Because there was something. A detail. A strange sensation that wouldn't leave me. A shadow growing slowly in the spaces between the letters. A discomfort. A doubt. Some of the letters I sent began to come back. Returned. But with strange marks. Smudged stamps. Inconsistent dates. Notes that made no sense. One of them was even open, as if it had been read by someone, but no one wanted to admit it. I began to notice small changes in the tone of my own writing. Words I didn't usually use. Dates that seemed to slip out of logical order. Sometimes I reread an entire letter and realized I had written it as if he were still reading. It was more than longing. It was a presence. But I told no one. Not because I didn't trust them, but because no one would have believed me. To them, I had passed the point of no return. I was now the woman who wrote letters to a dead man, the woman who refused healing, who dug into her own pain as if she wanted to live inside it. And deep down, maybe they were right, because even without understanding, I kept going. Even without answers, I persisted. Something inside me said it wasn't over yet, that the story wasn't complete, that there was more than what I had been told. And meanwhile, the letters kept leaving my hands night after night, as if I were merely the channel, as if someone, somewhere, still needed them as much as I did. It was on an ordinary night, one of those when exhaustion feels heavier than pain, that one of the letters came back different. The envelope, worn as always, carried my name scribbled across it, and a stamp reading, "Address non-existent." But there was something else. Something that froze me in place. The date. It was from 2 months earlier. But I remembered perfectly posting that letter 5 months before. I gathered all the other returned ones, there were 8 by then, and began to examine them, one by one. And that was when I noticed some were torn at the top, as if they had been opened and hastily sealed again. Others had swapped stamps, different paper weights, materials that didn't match what I usually used. And most important, the dates never made sense. One letter bore a New York postmark, even though the destination was Europe. Another had the wrong month, and one had a return stamp dated before it was supposedly sent. That awakened something I had been suffocating for a long time: suspicion. For months, I had forced myself to believe the official version, that he was dead, that there was no body, but there was certainty, that time passed, and with it, any chance. But those letters, those damned letters, were saying something else. I began rereading the ones I myself had written. Every single one. It was like hearing my own voice with a delay. And I noticed something unsettling. My writing had changed. Words I had never used before were now appearing again and again. Short sentences, almost coded, as if one part of me were writing while the other couldn't fully understand. More than that, I began to notice gaps. Small, but real. Dates that didn't match events. Days I swore I had lived one way, yet in the letters were described differently, as if I were forgetting pieces of my own past, or as if someone were tampering with my memories. I started dreaming of him often. Always the same dream. He was turned away, walking through a field covered in fog. I called out, but he never turned around. And when I ran toward him, he vanished. The last time I dreamed it, he dropped something on the ground before disappearing. A piece of paper. I woke up crying. And that same day, I found a letter I didn't remember writing. It was in the box, among the others. Same handwriting, same paper. But I had no idea when I had written it. That frightened me. Maybe I really was losing control. Maybe what they said was true. That I had sunk so deeply into pain that I no longer knew what was real. But there was something else. Something even madness couldn't explain. Because no matter how much the town had moved on, no matter how close the war was to ending, no matter how ready the world was to leave Matthew in the past, I felt his story wasn't finished. There were too many gaps, too many silences, and an unsettling sense that someone, somewhere, was trying far too hard to make me stop writing. But as long as I still had words, I would continue. Because every page I wrote seemed to pull something hidden out of the shadows. And I was about to discover what it was. I no longer wrote as much as before. Not because I had stopped believing, but because writing hurt in a different way now. As if each line were a needle-piercing time, stitching together pieces of a story no one wanted to see whole. The war ended. The town celebrated. Flags were raised. Bells rang. Embraces were exchanged between tears and smiles. The few who returned were welcomed as heroes. They marched through the streets as if carrying the weight of all those who hadn't come back. But he wasn't among them. Not that day. Not the following week. Not the following month. Matthew didn't return as a hero. He returned 2 years later. Without warning. Without uniform. Without ceremony. The news arrived like a stumble in the middle of the street. Elena, my sister, burst into the house, pale. "There's a man standing in front of the church. They say it's him." My head spun. A chill ran down my spine. I ran. And there he was. Standing on the stone sidewalk in front of the church, leaning on an improvised cane, thinner, eyes hollowed, and his face. A face that was his, and yet no longer his. Matthew. But not the Matthew I had preserved in my letters. Not the one who disappeared into trenches and smoke. The man standing there looked like someone who had returned from a place even God hadn't gone. He looked at me, and for a moment, everything stopped. The entire world fell silent, as if the town, time itself, even the air had paused to witness that reunion. But there was no embrace, no running, no beautiful words, only silence. He tried to smile, but his eyes didn't follow. Then he said, "I heard you wrote to me, every day." My mouth didn't respond, but my body trembled. Later we sat alone in the living room, facing each other. And then finally he spoke. Not all at once, but like someone carrying a weight that should never have been carried alone. Matthew hadn't died. He had been left to die. Captured. Forgotten. Denied. The army lost track of him during a bombing. He was captured by enemy forces, taken to an isolated camp outside official records. When he was finally found, the government chose to declare him killed in action rather than admit the mistake. They needed a number, he said, and I was a problem. He spent 2 years waiting for someone to come. 2 years being treated like a ghost in a prison camp where the world didn't exist. When he returned, they told him not to make a scene, that everything was already settled, that life had moved on. But he hadn't. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said, eyes wet. "The only thing that kept me alive were the words." Then he opened his backpack. From inside, he pulled out one of my letters, one I believed had never arrived. I only received 2. The second one saved my life. It reminded me I was someone to someone, that there was still a world where my name wasn't just a filed mistake. I cried, not from sadness, but because for the first time, I understood what those letters truly meant. He didn't come back to me. Not as before. Not as the man who left. But he came back because of me. And now I understood why I wrote. Because somehow, without knowing it, the letters weren't just to endure absence. They were to hold the thread that still connected us. And even though he was there, physically present, I knew. The war wasn't over for him. And maybe it would never be over for the 2 of us. Matthew slept silently in the back room. It was dawn. The house was dark. Only the sound of wind outside and the creaking of old furniture broke the quiet. I sat at the table, the box of letters open before me. Each page was a fragment of who I had been. Some I read. Others I only touched. I couldn't finish them. Because now that he was back, not as a promise but as a survivor, the words carried a different weight. He didn't remember everything. There were gaps, blackouts, scars that went beyond the body. Sometimes he woke in the night, sweating, shouting names I didn't recognize. Other times he spent hours staring out the window, as if waiting for someone to come for him. And slowly I understood. He hadn't come back for me. He had come back because I kept him alive. The letters were not declarations of love. They were ropes thrown into the dark, pieces of ordinary life that pulled him back when everything else had given up on him. He didn't come back to live a romance. He came back to find what was left of himself. And I was the only one who kept waiting. No one knew what to do with him. The government avoided responsibility. Doctors said time would help. The town fell silent. The same old silence, now even heavier. We stayed together for a few weeks, not as a couple, but as 2 survivors trying to understand what remained. Until one cold morning, he said to me, "I need to go." I already knew. I didn't ask questions. I just helped pack his bag, my hands shaking. He took a few clothes, the letter that saved his life, and one photograph of me, the only one I had kept inside the box, along with the last words I never sent. "If one day you return, you don't have to love me. Just tell me you lived." That morning he left. Not in uniform, not with honor, but with dignity. And I stayed. With the box, with the letters, with certainty. People expected a happy ending. They expected him to return, kiss me, and for everything to begin again. But life doesn't work that way, because sometimes loving someone is holding them in the world, even if that doesn't guarantee they will stay by your side. And I did that. With words, with silence, with resistance. Today, I no longer write letters, but I regret none of them. Because now I know, I was never writing to a dead man. I was writing to keep alive the part of him the world tried to erase, and I succeeded.